Good afternoon. We're going to go into a chapter that is over eating disorders. And unlike other textbooks that we've ever had, this McGraw-Hill Contemporary Nutrition actually has its own chapter for eating disorders. So it's very rare that kind of a general nutrition class will actually do this. But nevertheless, I think it is important. It's a short chapter. We won't go into everything that the textbook does, but we will go over some things. Now, I would like to preface this and always do when it comes to eating disorders and say that this information is for education purposes only. It's not something that anyone should take and try to provide advice to anyone else who may be having an eating disorder or disordered eating. And definitely should not be something that anybody tries to treat themselves with. It's just about learning what an eating disorder is, being able to identify signs and symptoms of it, and also learning about consequences of eating disorders. Now, also, it's important to understand that usually about anywhere from a quarter to a third of my students in every class have probably had some type of experience with an eating disorder. And if I was to extend that out to disordered eating, up to probably 50% of the class could have had experience with disordered eating, just because it's, even though if we look at the statistics, which we will, it will be much less than that, but it's one of the most common undiagnosed diseases because most people do not want to come forward and admit or seek help for disordered eating. So I always like to just put that out there and understand that I'm very well aware that sometimes this information can be very triggering. So if that happens to be your case, please make sure that you do seek assistance and help from either a registered dietitian, your physician, or another type of certified eating disorder specialist. All right, let's go. All right, so some of the objectives, real quick, I'm not going to go over them. You can see them for yourself. Want to make sure that you understand basic characteristics here. Most of this is what is outlining. The most important thing is to understand how does one eating disorder differ from another one. And in this one, I'd like to point out, looking at my pen here, but this word pica, this is another thing you might hear called pica, either way, is a type of disordered eating. So there is a difference between eating disorders and disordered eating. So we'll look at some of that. We'll also look at some of the ways that we as a community can try to reduce the incidence of eating disorders. And this is important to know because if you plan on having a family, a child of yours, either male or female, can be at risk for disordered eating. And there are some things that we can do to help to reduce that. All right, so eating disorders, and I'm bringing you to the very bottom here of the slide, do not discriminate. That's the basic purpose of this slide. Even though that, and historically, that white thin women, females of course, are those that are the highest at risk of eating disorders. Now, with globalization and with people immigrating, we see that all genders and also all ethnicities and races are all at risk for eating disorders. And we're starting to see higher populations. At one time, it really was more of a white female type of disorder, or it happened to be a weight related athlete, male or female. And that's not the case anymore. We're starting to see, especially as people are in different ethnicities and races are moving around and being exposed and integrated into different populations, those stereotypes, those desires to fit in with one or the other, is also really influencing in a more negative way. All right, so look at these concepts here. I want you to be able to differentiate between what is called disordered eating and an eating disorder. I also want you to understand how genetics and especially environment can impact your risk or your future family or loved one's risk of developing an eating disorder. And also understand why eating disorders are more common among adolescents than any other age group. All right, so it's important to understand that there's a lot more to food than just obtaining one's nutrients or health needs from it. We get a lot of emotions or emotional responses from eating, and we also eat because of emotional reasons and personal reasons. So, eating itself stimulates neurotransmitters and natural opioids and endorphins. So, all those things that really control how you feel. And that helps one to understand why this is a disorder or a disease and not just someone's own preference or decision to actually change their eating pattern in a very significant way. Disordered eating itself is usually short term, more mild in regards to changing eating patterns than compared to an eating disorder. Oftentimes, in both instances, disordered eating and eating disorders, it's in response to a stressful event, a big life change. It could be illness, or it could be a desire to change their own health for personal appearance reasons. Um, so this response to a stressful event, I want to just highlight that one. That can be in both disordered eating and eating disorders, and I'll explain more about that in a little while. Now, the media and certain diets and promoters oftentimes will trigger someone's idea, at least, of starting some type of disordered eating. You're trying to get to a certain shape, or maybe you really do go on a particular diet, let's say paleo or clean eating diet, in order to get healthier. And in some instances, what starts out as a healthy change really gets a little bit more obsessive compulsive about it. And that is definitely kind of that genetic trait that predisposes someone to be more vulnerable to taking something that was good and getting a little bit too obsessed with it. And that's when it goes for something that is healthy to unhealthy. Um, this need for social acceptance is a big one here, especially amongst our youth. We find images that are on the media. There's a big push to make sure that those that are marketing for commercials are trying to not use these filters to expose young people and young minds to what is really an unachievable body type for most people. Maintaining ultra slim body types is a common goal in today's culture, but and I would say it was even worse about a decade or 2 decades ago. Now we're getting a little bit better with kind of accepting that more curvy body, healthy body, strong body, but there's still some problems within even that strong body physique where it can really push someone to a disordered eating behavior. As I mentioned previously, eating disorders oftentimes just start out very harmless, just trying to change to a healthier eating behavior. Sometimes, and I would say many times, just working in the clinical area, what happens is that someone experiences, especially in a very young person who develops the eating disorder, they have really experienced a traumatic event. And very often, just from my own counseling, I would see maybe a family who has been torn apart either by a death or a divorce, and that child, young child, it could be pre-adolescent times, they feel out of control. And so they look to try to control something in their lives. And being that young, you're not really responsible or able to be that independent. And so one thing you are able to uh, be in control of is what you decide to eat and what you do not decide to eat. And that tends to be what we see as being an initial start or trigger for developing a disordered eating pattern. Now, eating disorders, I want you to know and write down, is that they are a psychological disorder, and they are diagnosed using the DSM-5 TR, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is updated ever so often and is something that is used in the clinical realm in order to have a code and to bill insurance and to be able to receive treatment with. On this slide, you see the main types of eating disorders. This is just a very short, more prominent list of eating disorders: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorders, and then the subthreshold eating disorder is kind of a umbrella term for many other ones that are almost an eating disorder but not quite there. All right. Now, I'll point out that anorexia nervosa is different from anorexia. Anorexia itself, if we were just saying that, could be just anyone who is not eating, maybe because of a sickness, illness, surgery, trauma. But anorexia nervosa has to deal with something that is going on psychologically. I'll point out also this genetics counts before about 50 to 83% of someone's risk. So if you yourself have had a disordered eating or eating disorder, then you really need to pay attention when you start having children, um, to try to make sure that you are being observant for their eating habits, and making sure that you're creating a very safe environment for them. If you have yourself also experienced one, kind of go back and think about, has your parents ever mentioned or kind of alluded to having a disordered eating pattern? But environmental factors also play a big role, and I'm going to really talk a little bit more about that. All right, so again, a lot of information on this slide, but some really interesting information to understand this kind of new and developing field, which is known as the psychiatric genetics. And this is something that is really exploring the genome, and looking into genes and associating specific gene markers with personal traits that either tells us someone is at risk for an eating disorder or more likely to develop one. They give you an example for neuroticism, and also anorexia. I would point out more common. I would see obsessive compulsive disorder and anorexia nervosa, and also for a disordered eating pattern being linked to autism. Um, and not talking about anorexia here, but some other types of disordered eating patterns uh, that are more prevalent amongst those with autism or who are on the spectrum. We can also start to look at some metabolic characteristics like hormones and measure those that regulate appetite, that would also maybe promote something that is like binge eating disorder. Uh, this particular here, eating disorders are difficult to treat. Oh my goodness, this is one of the hardest fields I have ever worked in, and it is very long and kind of mentally draining for someone who is counseling one with an eating disorder, and bless those who continue to do so, because they have a very high reoccurrence rate, because really treating the psyche is a very difficult thing to do and really requires expertise. And that's why I always point out you never ever want to try to treat yourself, or especially a loved one, a friend. And we a lot of times think we're helping someone when we are talking through or talking with someone about their disordered eating, but many times it's actually hurting it, because it just takes a few words to really push someone or trigger someone into a relapse. Um, let's see. I'll let you read the last part of this slide. All right, so looking at the prevalence of eating disorders, females definitely outnumber males, 12 to 1 for anorexia, 6 to 1 for bulimia, and 3 to 1 for binge eating disorders. But understand that males are a very unreported, undiagnosed gender, because many kind of have that feeling that, I guess, of extreme shame, guilt, or embarrassment from actually going and seeking treatment for their disordered eating. All right, some scoff questions. So these are oftentimes used in order to screen someone for a disordered eating. So if you go to a psychologist, counselor, even your physician, and they suspect that, hey, you're at risk for disordered eating, they may ask you some of these questions. Do you make yourself sick because you feel uncomfortably full? Do you worry that you have lost control over your eating? Have you recently lost more than 1 stone? You can see this was not developed in the US, which is 14 pounds in a 3-month period. Do you believe yourself to be fat when others say that you are too thin? And would you say that food dominates or controls your life? All right, so athletes are at a higher risk for developing an eating disorder at some point in their life. It could be due to a weight dependency, especially with wrestling, gymnastics, cheerleading, dance. Some of those are very weight dependent. It could be because simply the uniform. I know some of our volleyball girls, when they're wearing very, very small, slim things, track girls as well, have issues with uh, feeling that kind of encouragement from either the organization or a coach, or they're just their peers or themselves, to eat less. Uh, for example, someone who has been in gymnastics and cheered throughout college, and hopefully this has changed a lot, because I am in my 40s, and I will say that every Monday in school we had to weigh in the open gym in front of our team, which was co ed, and also any passerbyers who were checking in at the gym. And if we had gained any, even ounces, then we were forced to have additional exercise after our 4 hour practice in the mornings or after practice for that. And guys, the same way, if they did not gain weight, then they were in trouble as well and had to spend extra time in the gym. And those even had peers who were given weight loss medication, not medication, over the counter medication or supplements from our coach in order to lose weight. What we found out, obviously, especially with our gymnasts, is that when you restrict eating, you actually decrease your performance, right? You're inhibiting muscle performance. You're not able to practice as hard, which means you're not going to develop any. You're going to be less developed in your training and your specialties than your peers would, who are actually able to eat a good amount. And so, hopefully, most coaches now understand that, and I've seen a big push, at least from the coaches who have reached out to me to come and speak and to assist their team, that has changed. And a lot of the rules within some of our collegiate sports have changed as well, but it's definitely still out there. I still meet with a lot of people who and hear a lot of stories that it's still going on, but I feel like it's getting improved. We're just not there yet, and probably never will be 100%. Um, but I'll point out something. If you will look at gymnasts as we get ready for the Olympics, when they come in, you will notice that some of these girls, especially if you look back at some of the older Olympics, they will look as if they are all about 14, 15 years old, and then they will usually flash their age on the screen, and they'll be in late 20s, sometimes their 30s, and their growth is stunted, and that is because of a chronic eating disorder. And it could not necessarily be intentional from the athlete, but because of their training, just extremely high energy needs. And this is an example of what would be disordered eating, is that athlete is not really trying to be slim, but their training is so intense and for so long periods. Usually they are homeschooled at the gym and they are there for 8 hours a day, and they're not taking enough breaks in order to fuel up appropriately. And so puberty is delayed. Some of their growth hormones are affected. Their calcium stores for bone growth are affected until after they actually retire. And unfortunately, after they retire, it's too late for the bone growth to catch up, but the rest of the body can. Okay.